Before I start my talk tonight, I need to train you in recognizing two words that I'll be using. The first word is tune, which you hear as tune. So when I say tune, please hear tune. The second word is spelt P-A-I-N. Now when I say P-A-I-N, it may sound like P-I-N-E, but please hear P-A-I-N. Okay, now that we have that clear. For those of you who were here last year, you may remember me talking about one of my patients. It's something that I often do. A patient called Mark, who had come to see me because he had a lot of anxiety in his workplace as a result of a verbal assault, really, by one of his patients. And he was an experienced dialysis nurse, and part of the problem as a result of this assault was that he developed a lot of anxiety and lost confidence that he could insert the needles that evidently have to be inserted as part of the dialysis process. So he was referred to assist him, to get some assistance with this problem of anxiety. And after he learnt how to be mindful, he found that he could actually start to notice the arising of anxiety. And he noticed it through beginning to recognize the symptoms in his body that were associated with anxiety, symptoms like trembling or nausea or tightness. And whenever he had those sorts of sensations in his body, he recognised that they were a reflection of his mental state, and he started to find that he could tune into his emotional state by recognising these physical symptoms. So what happened as a result of this is he began to develop a bit more interest in how he felt. And his interest developed quite strongly, in fact, because he came in one day to see me and he told me that he'd come across a spider in his house. Australia has lots of snakes and spiders, and this wasn't a particularly harmful spider, but it's quite a large spider. And sort of looks a bit like a tarantula, but it's not as fat. It still looks quite fearsome though, because it's it's quite large and it's got long legs, and it's called a huntsman. So it's probably more scary to men with a name like that. Anyway. Mark came across this huntsman in his house, and he said his normal reaction to one of these spiders would be to kill it, because he had a little daughter, and she was only a couple of years old. But this time, when he came across the huntsman, he noticed something. And he realised that what he noticed were these sensations in his body that reminded him of exactly how he felt at work. So he recognised that what he felt at work was actually unsafe. And instead of killing the spider, he decided that he needed the spider. And he told me what he actually did is he went and sat down next to the spider and just sat and was mindful of the sensations in his body, with the result that he caught the spider and let it outside. So his mindfulness had allowed him not only to be able to recognize what was going on in his own mind and body with more clarity, but also overcome a habit that he had of killing something like the spider. So he found that over time his ability to manage his anxiety improved quite a bit by applying mindfulness, and he got his skill back and his speed back at inserting these dialysis needles. He might have had a little sort of residual anxiety, but I was at a point where I was almost ready to discharge him. And unfortunately, he then had another incident in his workplace. This time he had a physical injury. And when he came back to see me, even though he was managing reasonably well, he told me how sad he had been all of his life. He said if he was honest with himself, as long as he could remember, he'd felt sad. And he described it as an ocean of sadness. And when he said that to me, I just felt so sorry. Because he's such an ethical man, and he was obviously very compassionate about his work, and he really loved his work. And he had a happy family, and he was financially reasonably secure. He didn't have to work really hard. He'd been fairly wise about his earnings, and yet he still had all this sadness. So this is a pretty clear example, and it's probably pretty clear to all of us, how we can have these achievements in our life. We can have possessions, but we can still suffer. And we suffer because we mistake these things for our happiness. We think these are the things that will cause us to feel happy. And unless we do vipassana practice, we don't really understand the truth about suffering and happiness, what real happiness is and what suffering is. Obviously, Mark didn't want to be sad or anxious, but he got sad and he got anxious, just like we all do. And he suffered because of how he felt. He and we all want to hang on to the things that we think will provide us with happiness, the pleasant or enjoyable things in life, but we usually discover that we can't hang on to them. Before he became the Buddha, the Bodhisattva reflected on the desire of every living being to avoid suffering. He said, birth is suffering, decay is suffering, death is suffering. Sorrow and lamentation, pain, grief and despair are suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. What are the 5 aggregates or groups of clinging? What did the Buddha mean or the Bodhisattva mean when he said the 5 categories of things that we cling on to or hold on to? Well, they're everything. They're all of the things that we experience through the mind and body, through the sense doors. I'll name what the 5 aggregates are. Of course, you don't have to remember any of this, but part of the reason why we teach it is because we can begin to understand the objects of insight practice, because the 5 aggregates are the things that we pay attention to in our vipassana practice in order to reduce or overcome our suffering. So the 5 aggregates are matter, or the material aggregate. This is rupa The Pali word is rupa. Steve mentioned this last night. The second aggregate or group is called Vedana in Pali, and we've spoken a little bit about this as well. It's that pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling that is associated with every experience that we have. The third aggregate's perception, or sana in Pali, and it means the recognition or taking note of experience. The next one is volition or cetana. It's the intentional or effortful mental activity that we make before we undertake any activity. And the last is consciousness itself, or vijnanam in Pali. Consciousness or mere awareness. So these are the 5 aggregates. And therefore, the truth about suffering. As the Buddha said, these 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. And Mark was getting a glimpse of this suffering, and this is not the superficial sort of suffering that we all know about. We don't need to meditate to know that getting old is suffering, or getting sick is suffering, or losing something that we love is suffering. We all know that. There's a difference in what the Buddha said about these 5 aggregates of clinging. He said, what is impermanent is suffering. And what's impermanent? The 5 aggregates of clinging. And what's the 5 aggregates of clinging? All of our phenomenal experience. So, it's all suffering. In discussing these 5 aggregates of clinging, what I'm going to do tonight, in following on from Steve's talk somewhat last night, where he introduced the first foundation of mindfulness as mindfulness of the body, or Kayanupassana, is that I'm going to talk about the 5 aggregates in terms of kaya or body, and in terms of the sensations that we experience or that arise in the body. And primarily in terms of pain. We normally think of pain, well, maybe we don't, but we need to. We normally think of pain as a signal. In fact, that's all. Pain itself is a concept. The body doesn't feel pain. It's a combination of the mind and the signals from the body that ends up being called pain. Pain's actually a signal of threat, usually. It's something that when we have these sorts of signals, we generally interpret them as threatening or meaning that something's wrong. So these signals are sent from the body along specialised nerve endings up the spinal cord and to the brain. And the brain receives these signals or perceives them. It's perception, one of the aggregates. And when these signals are perceived, they then get associated with thoughts and emotions and memories, and we call this combination pain. We can't see pain. In fact, we can't identify pain independently of the person who's got it telling us about it, or behaving in a way that suggests to us that they may be in pain. So when we experience this perception, this signal that's perceived as threat, that can then lead to another whole array of physiological responses being triggered off. The mind and the body's sort of automatic reaction to dealing with threat. And these automatic reactions that the body has are usually meant to be life-saving, but in time, because of these patterns that I've talked about that we develop, we often perceive signals from the body as threatening when they really are no longer threatening. However, when we perceive something as threatening, it will actually enhance the experience. This is something that we can actually experience through our meditation. I'll talk about a little later in the talk. So we have these signals that are perceived as a threat. The threat then triggers off a physiological response that's often one of fear or anxiety, or can be sadness or despair, and those responses enter into like a feedback loop back to the perception of threat. So we find we're just in this self-defeating spiral after a while. Another kind of threat that can come out of the perception of these signals when we're meditating is, when these things arise, these sensations arise in the bodies, as meditators we think that they mean something about us and our ability to practice. So when that happens, we can also develop another set of emotional responses of doubt or lack of confidence. And this can obstruct our ability to be mindful. However, what we learn in our practice of mindfulness is to start to disentangle the signal, the sensations in the body, the thoughts and emotions and other responses we may have to the signal. So we start identifying the sensations according to their qualities like hardness or roughness or heat or burning or stabbing. And we start to see that it's actually possible to have this signal inputting, if you like, into the nervous system, and not necessarily have that array of thoughts and reactions because we've become mindful of either the sensations themselves or the reaction. So what mindfulness starts to allow us to do is separate the signal from the thoughts and emotions, from our personal story, if you like, and see that both the signal and the reaction are impersonal and impermanent. And when we see that we don't have to get caught up in the story, and we don't have to believe that the unpleasant signal is about us, it's just a signal, then we can head towards a reduction in our suffering. What we've been learning, and we've just started off about these 4 foundations of mindfulness, is that there are these 4 areas where we can apply mindfulness. And if we consider applying mindfulness to the movement of the breath at the abdomen, if we're concentrating on mindfulness of the body, we initially discern sometimes the shape or form of the abdomen moving, but after a while we just don't notice the shape anymore. We begin just to notice the movement itself, and even some of the sensations sometimes that are associated with that motion. And while we're practicing our mindfulness of the breathing, if we're fairly still, we begin to notice these sensations arising elsewhere in the body. And these sensations are often uncomfortable. And if we're unable to be mindful of them, that the discomfort then travels down the route that I've already described, and we can end up feeling pretty miserable. The perception of these signals of sensations arising in other parts of the body is usually unpleasant. So noticing this unpleasant nature is mindfulness of feeling, the second foundation of mindfulness. Feeling will always arise whenever there's any contact of or sense impression. So with the body in contact with the floor or the chair, even though it may not be all that obvious to us at the moment, there's a feeling that's either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral arising with that perception of contact. So in terms of pain, that sense impression is the reception of the signal, and the feeling is the registration of the signal as unpleasant. If we can be mindful of the sensations, then there's a possibility that the reaction to them doesn't arise. But if it does arise, we can often feel very unhappy about what's happening to us, feel very disappointed and even discouraged. We can feel like these painful sensations are stopping us from doing our meditation practice. And if only they would go away, then we'd really be able to practice properly. Unfortunately, as long as we have a mind and a body, it won't matter whether we've been practicing for 1 hour or 1 day or 1 year or 10 years. We're still going to have unpleasant or painful sensations arising in the body. So how do we be mindful in this situation? And while I'm talking about physical painful sensations, you need to think the same way about the experience of emotion in the body, because often people experience emotion in the body and there's physical sensations associated with that emotion. So while I'm talking about this mindfulness of these sensations, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, it's the same. And that applies whether we're observing the emotional sensations in the body or whether we're observing them in the mind. And I've done this with a couple of people already today in terms of looking at an emotional state in the body or in the mind. We're just observing the sensations, and I'll go into a little bit more detail a little later about that. But first of all, I'd like to tell you a story about the wrong way of being mindful, or perhaps the right way of being mindless about the experience of pain. You may identify yourself in the story. I'm not sure if I told this story last year or not, but it's such a good example of what can happen if you're mindless that I'm sure you'll probably see yourself in it somewhere. It was some time ago when I went to practice in Burma, and I was going there to practice for a couple of months. And conditions in Burma are fairly uncomfortable, to put it mildly. So as I was going to go for a couple of months, I decided I needed to be comfortable. And so I took a zabuton, and I guess you know what a zabuton is. It's the flat sort of cushion to sit on, to put on the floor. And I took my cushion, which isn't quite a zafu. It's an enhanced version of a zafu. It's a foam cushion that doesn't seem so big at home, but everything's relative. Anyway, I got to this meditation centre, and I'd written ahead, and people came to pick me up. These lovely Burmese people came to pick me up and took me to the meditation centre. And it was very busy. There was a lot of people. It's a small centre, but there are a lot of people there. There are about a couple of hundred women in the hall. Not very men. I think there were only about 10 men. So I was sitting in the area of the hall where the women were sitting, and because there were so many women, there wasn't a lot of space. And so my hosts had bought a little Burmese version of a zabuton, which doesn't account for my height for a start. So it was about 50, probably not even 60 centimetres square, and it had a piece of foam in it about probably a millimetre thick. It had a very pretty cover on it. And they proudly gave me this and pointed out a spot, moved a few other pieces of cloth, quite frankly, at that point. That's what the Burmese women were sitting on, pieces of cloth. They moved a couple of those aside and put my little bit down there. So I had a few concerns about sitting on this little square of foam. Anyway, I thought, I'd try it out. It was on a timber floor, so I decided I'd give it a go. And I brought my foam cushion over to sit on. And of course the little mat, I managed to get one knee on it, I think. And after a while I kind of decided I needed to give up, and I needed to bring my zabuton over. So when I had the combination in the hall, I carefully made sure I brought it over in the lunch break, so no one could see me bringing it in. And fortunately there's noble silence on retreat, so no one could say anything, but it really stood out, as you can imagine. So anyway, I thought everything would be fine, and I started sitting on my proper cushion and my proper mat, and it seemed like things were going okay for the first couple of sittings, but suddenly I started to get all this pain, and I didn't remember having so much pain before. I'd always sort of thought, been practicing for a while, I can sit for periods of time and not too much pain arises, or where was all this pain coming from? So I started to kind of examine my zabuton, and it realised that probably what had happened, because it was filled with like a kapok. Do you know what kapok is? Yeah. It was sort of, and I thought what had actually happened was over the years of using it, it had compressed, and it had become hard, so it wasn't really soft anymore. So I'd pick it up and I'd take it outside the meditation room and I'd bash it and try and fluff it up and come put it back down again, but it would still seem like it was very painful. So I started thinking, well, this was really dumb. I should have checked this out before I left Australia. I'd given that little square of foam back to the people who'd And I was cursing that I'd given this little bit of foam back, because I thought, just a millimetre of foam, it could have made a difference. So then I decided that what I needed to do is get some foam. So I thought I'd have to go to the office and ask someone to buy me some foam, and I didn't know how big a piece of foam I needed, so I was over there trying to measure the Zabuton, so I'd get the right dimensions, because I didn't have scissors or anything like that to cut it down. It would have to be the right size to slip it in. So I went to the office, and people in Burma are very gracious. What they must think, I don't know, but they're always ready to do anything to help the foreign yogis, anything you want that'll make it easier for you to practice. So, I went and asked for my bit of foam with all the dimensions carefully measured. Anyway, that day went by, and I anticipated that the girl in the office would probably bring me the foam the next day. And I was just gone in to have lunch in the dining hall, and she came up to me and she said, "Look, I'm very sorry. I was late getting home from work last night and I didn't have a chance to go to the foam shop." And I said, "Oh, that's okay, So a lot of disappointment and, and anger, and back in agony in the hall, and thinking that, tomorrow I'll get the piece of foam and things will be okay, the pain will be easier. And of course the next day she came to me again. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry, the foam shop was closed," and it's like, okay, that's okay. And I that afternoon I went up into the meditation hall, and I was sitting, and I suddenly realised that even though the pain was there, because my concentration and mindfulness had started to build up, I'm not sure how, given all of this, running around that I was doing, but something had happened, and the concentration and mindfulness had developed sufficiently that while I could still notice that there was pain, it actually didn't seem to be bothering me so much. So I cancelled the foam order and realised that all I needed to do was to be mindful of the physical sensations. And in fact, if I'd been mindful of the kind of chain reaction, I would have saved myself a lot of unhappiness. So it's probably why in the Noble Eightfold Path there isn't a step about having a large piece of foam. You don't actually need it. But it did seem to make it a little clearer to me what we need to be doing with our mindfulness practice. And what we need to be doing is looking fairly deeply and clearly at our experience. That's one of the things that vipassana means. Vipassana means seeing or penetrating deeply into the characteristics of experience. And those characteristics are impermanence, non-self, and suffering. So when painful sensations arise, and as I mentioned earlier, please note that this also applies to sensations in the body or the mind that may be associated with painful emotions, we need to direct our attention towards the sensations. And this is that quality of attention that Steve mentioned at the end of the talk last night when he introduced Vitakka and Vichara. Vitakka is like taking the mind to the object, and another way of thinking about it is it's an effortful activity. One of the ways of describing it in the text is when a bird flaps its wings before it takes off. So it's flapping and flapping and flapping, and this is the taking the mind to the object, making this effort to get it onto the object, and finally the bird becomes airborne. And it's seemingly less effort, and that's that kind of vichara aspect of attention, where we can now keep the mind on the object. So we take attention to the painful sensations, to the unpleasant sensations. But we have to be careful about how we're directing our attention. And this is a common mistake that we make because we don't understand suffering. We have to understand suffering to understand the cause of suffering and the way to get out of suffering. And by understanding suffering, what we have to understand is whatever is impermanent is suffering. So when we're looking at our unpleasant sensations, we're not looking at them with the intention of making them disappear. We're not trying to hammer it with our mindfulness into oblivion. We're not going pain, 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 and hoping that it's going to stop. That's the wrong way of paying attention to the sensations, whatever the sensations may be. Because if we're trying to be mindful like that, we've got mindfulness, but we've got something else as well. We've now got anger. We're angry at these sensations, and we're trying to, be mindful of them so they'll go away. The right way of paying attention to the sensations is with the intention of understanding them. Because we're trying to understand their impermanent nature. And because when we start to see that they're impermanent and they're coming and going, they're not us. We don't have to identify with them. We don't have any control over them anyway. They're just coming and going. So we only begin to understand this about any of our experience when we understand the nature of suffering. Suffering is what's impermanent. The characteristic of suffering is impermanence. So, when we start to direct our attention towards these sensations, often what we see is something solid. Yes, a solid mass. And it feels fairly kind of consistent. But if we can keep observing, we'll actually begin to see that solidity itself is a misperception. And that what looks like solid is actually a mass of different sensations. So they could be different in intensity and they could be different in quality. So one part of where we're looking we may perceive as hard, another part may be burning in quality, another part could be tingling. We may notice that, some of these sensations are stronger than others, and when we observe some, they may diminish in intensity. If we observe others, they may increase in intensity. Sometimes we might start to notice a space between these sensations. So what looks solid now we see as these little patches of sensation and patches of space. The first night I gave a talk when I held up my hand and said, "What do you see?" We see hand. We also see hand and space. There's space between the fingers. And this is what we start to see when we pay attention carefully to the experience of painful sensations in the body. We start to see that it's not all solid and compacted. We keep looking, it breaks up. So, as well as seeing the different quality of the sensations themselves and how they might fluctuate, we also start to notice the unpleasantness that can be associated with these sensations. Likewise, if they're pleasant, then we'll notice the pleasantness that's associated with them. And I mentioned this point the first night and again now, and it'll be kind of a recurring theme, and probably start to understand more why a little later in the retreat. This understanding of experience as to whether it's pleasant, unpleasant or neutral is critical. So we need to be clear that the nature of the sensations of what we're experiencing is unpleasant. Because without mindfulness of the unpleasant nature, that's where we start getting caught up. That's where the story starts. we do start the story. Okay, if we do start this kind of chain reaction of, thoughts and memories and how it's all happening to me, and if that starts to become more obvious than the physical sensations themselves, we start getting lost in our head about what's going on physically, we can notice, we can be mindful of that. We can turn our attention onto the mental component of the suffering and pay attention to thinking, or to irritation, or to anger, whatever it may be that arises. So this may mean that we focus on the physical sensations. We might then go to a thought. We might come back to the physical sensations. As I said last night, we're not tied to one particular object. We're noticing the obvious object as it arises. We might start noticing the connection between if anger arises in response to something that's happening in the body or even in the mind, that the sensations themselves become stronger. So here's painful sensations in the body and we're trying to be mindful of them, and we notice we're getting angry about them because we don't like them. You may begin to notice that as you get angrier, the perception of the sensations is that they increase in intensity. And this is something that Western science only discovered in the 60s. The influence of the state of mind on the experience of painful sensations. Of course, the Buddha knew it 2,500 years ago. Science discovered it in the 60s. But we can see this clearly in our meditation practice. The painful sensations will feel more intense if there's a negative reaction to them. So when you see this in your meditation, it starts to teach you that the sensations are also impermanent, because they're changing. They may be getting stronger, but that means they can also get weaker. It's a bit like, people have asked me a little bit about this, when I talk about paying attention with curiosity, it's this joyful interest that the Buddha spoke about. It's a bit like imagining you're a scientist and you're undertaking some kind of research. If you already know what the data are going to reveal, there's no point in doing the research. What you're trying to do with your meditation practice is not make an assumption about what the mind and body is going to reveal. This is the research, this is the experiment. A good scientist may have a hypothesis, but the scientist is looking at what the data reveals, whether it disproves the hypothesis or not. And of course, the scientist will use the tools that are available to analyze the data. And, the tools that are used will, to some degree, determine the scientist's conclusions. The same for us. The tools that we use to observe our experience will determine what we see, what we understand. And mindfulness is the tool. And like a good scientist, mindfulness notices what's going on without making any judgments about it, without censoring it in any way. Mindfulness notices impartially. It observes what arises. It accepts it all, because the nature of suffering is impermanence. The Buddha said, what is suffering? The 5 aggregates. And they're suffering because they're impermanent. So, when these sensations arise in the body associated with physical suffering or emotional suffering, and we direct our mindfulness towards it, we observe the sensations in order to notice as much as we can. These qualities, if you like, that I mentioned, things like heat or hardness or tingling or sharpness, roughness, observing how they arise and they pass away again, perhaps only to reappear somewhere else. As I've mentioned to some people already, if possible, if the strength of the mindfulness and concentration allows it, go to the strongest point. Put your attention on the strongest point and see what happens when you observe the strongest point. If it becomes difficult to observe the strong point, back off. Go to a sensation that's further away, that's a little easier for the mindfulness and concentration to notice. It's a bit like, those mag lights where you can adjust the beam, and you can have a diffuse light or you can have a spotlight. So going to the strongest point of the pain is like putting the spotlight on it. It's really going to throw it up into fairly stark detail because there's more light. You'll see more clearly. But if the sensations are very strong and it feels like mindfulness and concentration can't keep up with that, then back off. Go to the diffuse light, if you like. Go to sensations that are not so difficult to observe. If we feel that we can't keep noticing the sensations patiently, then the trick is not to get into a battle with it. Otherwise, we're just kind of we're kind of putting ourselves through some kind of endurance test, and that's not mindfulness. So it's at that point, as I mentioned in the instructions this morning, that we recognise that we may need to move if moving is something that's actually going to relieve the strength of the sensations. In terms of physical sensations, we may move our posture. In terms of very strong, difficult, emotional sensations, we may need to, widen our perspective. If we're sitting, for example, and it's becoming too intense, we may need to think about getting up or opening our eyes, widening the beam, if you like, so it doesn't feel so focused on the emotional sensations. So we make some kind of change and we recognise that that's what we're doing, and we're mindful about noticing the change in movement that we might make. So as someone said in the interview today, what she'd done with some of her own difficulties was that she'd learned to give up the fight. And it's actually something I say to my patients who are trying to adjust to pain, is we've got to give up the fight against these sensations. We've actually got to give in. Give up the struggle, give in to observing the sensations. Because when we start to give in and allow mindfulness a chance to observe and understand what's going on with these sensations, we're not resisting them anymore, and we're actually accepting them as a normal part of what we need to do to develop mindfulness and concentration, then the mind actually starts to find a balance. It's not trying to avoid it anymore, so it actually begins to find a balance, and we begin to experience that even with these difficult sensations, there can be a peacefulness of mind or a calmness of mind. So, in a sense, we begin to develop a degree of equanimity towards what's happening to us. We didn't arrive at that point by trying to get rid of something. We didn't arrive at that point by trying to get something. We arrived at that point by noticing what was there, by paying careful attention with curiosity, with loving kindness, with acceptance to whatever's arising. So what we begin to see is the true nature of the sensations. We've started to see that they're impermanent, they're impersonal, and they're suffering. So what I'd like to do is actually just conclude with something that one of my patients wrote about his experience of pain and his experience of mindfulness as applied to painful sensations. And this is someone again who hasn't done intensive practice, who has learnt mindfulness as part of a program that I teach meditation on at a hospital in Sydney. This man was in his 50s, I think, when he came to the program. He had a pretty difficult life. He has had disability all of his life, and had his spine had fused in places, and he had other problems like having only one kidney and having cysts growing on that. And he had sort of got to a point in his life where he thought that he was basically going to end up in a wheelchair. And he said he was at a point where he was starting to think of fairly extreme ways of ending his pain. So he made it to the pain clinic at the start of 2002. And first of all, what he writes about is how do I convey to you in simple terms how it feels to be in chronic pain. He says, he's not a Buddhist, this man either, so he says, entering the room of suffering. A person is taken from the street at random. They are led to a room full of millions of clones of themselves with whips. It's explained that they're to be beaten by these clones for the rest of their life, that this is their fate and no one has a right to avoid their fate. The person says, this is unfair. There's many of them and I am but one. But it is still too fair by far, and shackles are brought out and placed on the person's legs. But they have no shackles, and now I can't run any more. Then the person's hands are chained behind their back. Now I can't even fend their blows or protect myself. Then a blindfold is applied. But this is insane. I've done nothing wrong. I have no chance at all. This is madness. The person then spends the rest of their life stumbling, blind and powerless, beaten by powerful blows from unseen tormentors. Over loudspeakers, a voice calls out to them, this pain is forever, no escape, no hope, no chance. It's their own voice. They're given painkillers and stronger doses until they rest on a cloud of morphine, oblivious to sensation, oblivious and powerless. Providing an alternative, mindfulness meditation. When we ask, what does this person need, the answer is obvious, freedom. That freedom comes in 3 phases. Understanding, removing the blindfold, movement, removing the shackles, choice, removing the handcuffs. Mindfulness meditation is a path towards all of these freedoms. The mind is a sea upon which rages a storm of anxiety and thought. Mindfulness meditation firstly helps you see the vessel in which you sail that sea. We start with the breath. My breathing is a physical sign of my life. So as I breathe, I notice and affirm my life, my connection to all other life, and my own right to happiness within that life. My breathing becomes a living affirmation of living. The breathing takes us on a journey of discovery. We notice everything, the clock ticking, the subtle sounds of life in the street outside. We notice and then we return to the breath and that connection with ourselves. We center our mind back to the breath. we begin to train our mind to observe all events as being only as important to us as we wish them to be. Therefore, pain can become an observable and irrelevant phenomena. Oh yes, the pain is still there, but it doesn't hurt as much. Mindfulness does not end after we've stopped our meditation session. One begins to walk, drive, speak, and live in a mindful way. Everything in life can be observed for the first time, as often as you want. A certain freshness is noticed in all aspects of life. How does all this help our prisoner of suffering? Well, in truth, the prisoner is captive to anxiety and depression as much as anything else. When meditating, they can, for a period, leave their room of pain and walk in a garden, taking in the pure air of a spring morning, maybe only for seconds or minutes at first. In effect, the discipline of mindfulness meditation lets them leave that room for longer and longer periods. They can experience an alternative to the sadness and loss of that other place. Importantly, it does not only help us while actively meditating. Mindfulness becomes a path that is natural and constant. One becomes mindful more and more. Events like pain just don't creep up anymore. You get warning and you can prepare more effectively. The mind can still itself and let the pain wash through it without doing the psychic damage that previously was an inevitable consequence of a bad day. This is the path of choice and freedom. It's a path that requires work. No one can force a person to understand that alternative. It rests as a trusty tool rests beside an old fence, a gentle and effective option for those who reach out and pick it up. We may even pick it up ourselves and hand it to them, but in truth, each person lives in whatever place they choose. Mindfulness meditation says to the pain sufferer, put down your burden of anxiety and come walk in the sunshine. So that's the conclusion for tonight's talk. Let's just sit for a minute or two.